Godmorgen alle sammen. Vi er ved at være parat her til fredagens udgave af konferencen her. Og jeg vil lige fortælle lidt om kadencen i dag, hvad der skal ske. Herefter vi har haft de to første oplæg fra Gossop og Henrik Random, så vil vi have en 10:30, så vil vi have sådan en kaffepause, og så i den periode der, det får man en halv time, så man også samtidig kan tjekke ud af hotellet. Og så kører vi videre, som det fremgår, men kun frem til kl. 11:30, altså vi får en lidt tidligere frokost eller lunch, end vi havde i går. Og efter lunch kører vi så videre med Karina fra Wien, og så vil vi så lave sådan en lille panel heroppe, hvor vi også der står bag det her, vi har lavet sådan en lille opsummering af nogle af de ting, som er kommet frem her på konferencen. Og så vil vi lægge op til sådan en generel debat. Ja, og så afslutter konferencen efter Gita Bensons wind-up kl. 15. Jo, og egentlig der er også en ting, som jeg blev gjort opmærksom på. Og det er faktisk, at Stockholm havde 750 års jubilæum i går. Så det er jo her i den nordiske sammenhæng her vigtigt at nævne. Og så spiller de fodbold i øjeblikket også. Godt. Now I'll switch to English in order to introduce the first speaker. I'm very happy to be able to present Gossop, Professor Michael Gossop at the conference. And Michael Gossop is from the National Center, the National Addiction Center at the Maudsley Institute of Psychiatry in London. And besides being author and co-author of many books and articles and being member of several editorial boards on international journals, you're also the project, or were the project director of the National Treatment Outcome Research Study, which just ended this year. And you will speak today, you present a paper on the assessment and treatment of stimulant problems. In other words, what works and why does it work? Welcome.
I think I'll use this one. Less than. Okay, thanks. Okay, is that working? Mm-hmm. Well, thank you very much for inviting me here. This talk has a little bit of a history. It's a version of a talk that I was asked to give to the European Union at the end of last year on stimulant problems, and particularly due to people's concern about the use of ecstasy. And when putting the talk together, I had a number of things that I thought that I would like to do, and one of the issues that I thought was important was to say something that was more positive about the treatment of stimulant problems. I don't know how things are in the Scandinavian countries, but in many countries there's a feeling of confusion and pessimism about the treatment of stimulant problems. People often make statements about how extremely difficult this area is and how we know very little about it and how the outcomes are very poor and the treatment is especially problematic. And I felt it was necessary to put together a talk that said something that was perhaps able to offset some of that pessimism. So that's something of the history of this talk. I'd like to say something. The talk's in broadly two parts. The first part of the talk, I want to say something generally about the treatment of drug problems. And the first thing that I really want to say is that we need to be very clear about the separate dimensions of drug problems. People often talk generally about drug problems without specifying precisely what they mean. And I think that it's important from that point of view to make a clear distinction between what I've described here as these three dimensions of drug use. There's the consumption behaviour, which is the more descriptive or behavioural dimension of drug use, the problems themselves, and there's the issue of dependence, and I'll go through those. Consumption behaviour, well, this is the thing that is the most obvious feature of drug use, and it's one of the issues that people tend to focus upon. But if you break down consumption behaviour, that itself has a number of separate facets. The most obvious feature, of course, is the type of drug being used, and this breaks down into how frequently it's used, in what quantities it's used, the route of administration by which the drug is taken. These, of course, are very obvious. It sounds like basic stuff. It sounds like the type of thing that it's hardly worth being reminded of. But it is perhaps worth spending just a second or two thinking about this, because there are clear and important distinctions here to be made which are highly relevant to understanding stimulant drug use problems. The drug taker who is taking a small amount of stimulant drugs on an infrequent basis is clearly a different type of animal to the person who is taking high doses on a very frequent basis. Again, this is absolutely obvious stuff, but it's a distinction that is regularly blurred. When people talk about problems, they frequently talk about ecstasy users or amphetamine users or cocaine users, and they don't make clear distinctions between the manner in which the drug is being taken. And again, route of administration. This is an absolutely fundamental issue with regard to the effects that drugs have upon the user, and it has clear and very important implications for the type of problems that the user is likely to run into. Again, it's a distinction that is very, very seldom made. You can read many articles on drug use problems that simply do not specify the route of drug administration. They just take it for granted. And within all of this, there's the issue of polydrug use. Polydrug use is something that's of great interest to me. I've become much more interested in it over the past few years. It's always been clear that most of the people who take drugs are in fact multiple drug users. They take several different drugs. And the more problematic the drug user, the more likely they are to be taking a wide range of different drugs. So when we talk about drug takers, we talk about cocaine users, we talk about heroin users. In fact, there's almost no such thing as the heroin user. If you look at most heroin users, typically they will be taking perhaps 4, 6, maybe even 10 other drugs. The issue of polydrug use is something that is extremely important. It has clear implications for our understanding of drug problems, but it gets lost in our focus. People tend to think in single issues. So when people are talking about stimulant drug problems, they talk about cocaine users. They forget that many of these cocaine users will also be taking many other drugs. Most of them will be taking alcohol, sometimes in high and problematic doses. Some of them will be taking drugs such as heroin. These are clearly not incidental features of understanding who you're dealing with and what sort of problems they run into. It's clear that we should separate out the consumption behaviours from the problems that people have. There are obvious relationships between these, and some of these relationships we can talk about, and some of them are going to be perfectly obvious to you. Nonetheless, it's important to bear in mind that these dimensions can be thought of as independent. Conceptually, we can regard these dimensions as different types of things. And if you run them together, then you tend to get into trouble. So the problems, well, the problems need really no amplification. I mean, all of you here are aware of the type of problems that arise. much concern about the physical health of the user, particularly since the HIV virus was identified. More recently, there's been concern about hepatitis, viral hepatitis infections among injecting drug users. There are acute medical problems that may arise. If we're talking about ecstasy, then there are a number of acute problems that may result from the use of drugs such as ecstasy, and these typically take people to accident and emergency departments when they're serious. There are mental health problems associated with all forms of drug use, particularly regular drug use. And there are accidental injuries. Accidental injuries tend to be rather neglected in our understanding of these problems, but nonetheless these represent a considerable burden of damage both to society and to individuals. This is a study that we did some years ago in London, looking at some of the adverse effects described by users of different stimulant drugs. The three drugs that are presented here are ecstasy, shown in yellow, cocaine powder, shown in grey, and the amphetamines. Most of the amphetamine use in the United Kingdom is amphetamine sulfate, which is manufactured illegally within the country and is relatively widely available and is relatively widely used. The other amphetamines are available, but mostly the red bar refers to the use of amphetamine sulfate. And the bars show the different types of symptoms that were reported by users as being severe problems. Typically, the amphetamine users described having more problems and more severe problems than the other users. MDMA and cocaine powder were broadly comparable and were at a relatively low level. The problems that were described, well, again, these come as no surprise to you. I'm sure you're all well aware of these type of problems, and they've probably been discussed in earlier presentations. Moving on to the third dimension, it's very important to distinguish, and again to make a conceptual distinction between problems and dependence. Dependence clearly is a major problem that arises as a result of the use of drugs for many people. Nonetheless, it's important to distinguish between dependence as a particular type of problem and the other types of problems, the health problems, mental health, acute medical emergencies, and so forth. Dependence is important for a number of reasons, not the least of which that it's the most common reason why people voluntarily approach and seek help from treatment services. And our understanding of dependence has changed quite a bit over the last 20 years. And it is now much more focused upon behavioural and psychological issues. It's clear that the core features of dependence are to do with impaired control, behavioural control over drug use. People find that they have difficulty in moderating their habits. They find that they have difficulty in avoiding use even when they are highly motivated to do so. And under those circumstances, they tend to have strong feelings of compulsion to go on using even when they're not using, which can last for considerable periods of time and which can also re-emerge even after long periods of abstinence from drugs. The earlier definitions of dependence tended to focus on both tolerance and withdrawal symptoms as being key features. It's now increasingly accepted that these are not necessary features of dependence. Our interest in them was probably largely determined by the fact that our models for addiction were heroin addiction and alcohol addiction, where clearly tolerance and withdrawal are major features of addiction to those two drugs. But in more recent years, one of the big developments that has changed our understanding of dependence has in fact been the development of people having severe dependence upon stimulant drugs, particularly upon cocaine. And it's worth reminding ourselves that even as late as the 1980s, it was quite possible to find very clear and strong statements in medical textbooks saying that cocaine was not a drug of dependence. The reason for this is because it doesn't tend to produce a classical dependence syndrome. It doesn't tend to produce a clear withdrawal syndrome, for example, when people have been dependent and stop using it. But tolerance and withdrawal have now been relegated. They are still important. They have a considerable clinical importance, for example, but they're no longer regarded as being central and key features of the dependence syndrome. So those three dimensions I would really urge you to pay attention to, because a lot of the misunderstandings arise as a result of people failing to make that distinction. Speaking to a group such as this, I feel as though I'm preaching to the converted. I mean, I don't feel as though there's likely to be much resistance, and there may even be a feeling of some boredom as a result of me telling you this. But it's worth bearing in mind that a lot of the arguments that develop around drug problems are to do with a failure to understand these issues. If you're talking about somebody who is an occasional user of ecstasy, who is not experiencing significant problems, and who is not physically or psychologically dependent upon the drug, then that is quite a different issue to if you're dealing with somebody who is a long-term, regular user with an established dependence upon drugs. There are quite different issues raised by these. So, how do we approach the issue of treatment? Well, I think it's important to look at what we're actually tackling when we do treatment. Is there an objective problem? Is there just a risk of a problem? If so, what is that risk measurable? Can it be quantified in any way? Does the user actually perceive there to be a problem? This is, again, a key issue. I know that the question of coercion is something that the Scandinavian countries have more experience of than many other of the European countries. But the extent to which the user experiences the problem, recognises it and is willing to tackle it is clearly a key issue, and a great deal of the literature on motivation enhancement, stages of change and so on, much of that work over the last 10 years has been addressed to that sort of problem. Okay, so who comes for treatment, and to what extent should we focus on substances, and to what extent on treatment needs? Let me say something about who comes for treatment. And much of the material I'm going to show you now comes from the National Treatment Outcome Research Study that we did in the UK. So it's very much based upon a British sample and the British problem. I'm going to stick to that because it's what I know best. I mean, there's a big literature, of course, from the United States. The European literature is less well developed in many respects, but I'm going to talk about the situation in Britain, which is applicable in some respects to your problems, and it's what I know best. I'm not going to be so arrogant as to assume that I know the problem in your own countries, because I simply don't know it as well as you do. So who comes for treatment? Well, we divided up the sample. We did a cluster analysis on the drug use of our clients. The Entor study was a study of over 1,000 people who were recruited to drug treatment services in 1995, and we followed them up over a 5-year period. So this is a sample that came into treatment in 1995, and this is the first group that came out of the cluster analysis, and this is the largest group. It's not difficult to characterize this group. They are effectively heroin addicts. The main drug that they used was opiates, and of the opiates, overwhelmingly the most common drug that they were using was illicit street heroin. There's some use of other drugs. Stimulants I've shown in red because I'm talking today about stimulant problems. Benzodiazepines, some use of that, and some problematic drinking. I'm going to say less about this group. This is the second of the groups. The first group represented about 2/3 of the sample. This group represents about 1/4 of the sample. And these tend to be the more chronic people. This tends to be an older group of drug users who are attending treatment services. Many of them are aged around about 40, some of them are older than that. Typically they've been using drugs for many, many years, often 20 years or more. They are amongst the most severely dependent and amongst the most severely problematic of the people who come to our services. And their pattern of use tends to be characterized by widespread use of sedative-type drugs. So they're using opiates, they're also using a lot of benzodiazepines, often in huge doses, and many of them are drinking excessively. Many of these people would be diagnosed as having an alcoholism problem if they were not also drug users. Some use of stimulants, but not very much. And this is the third group, which is perhaps of greatest relevance to this talk. People using stimulants, also using other drugs, many of them using opiates, many of them using heroin, but also using some benzodiazepines and alcohol. But these are pretty heavy stimulant users, and they represent about 11% of the sample of our study. So I'm going to say something about the treatment of these people. This is showing their stimulant use at intake to treatment, and I've broken down the drugs that they're using into amphetamines, which is generally amphetamine sulfate, cocaine powder, and crack cocaine. There's no mention of ecstasy here because ecstasy is almost never mentioned as a main problem drug by these people. Many of them had taken ecstasy, but the number who described ecstasy as being either their main problem drug or even a serious problem for them was extraordinarily low. It was just 1 or 2 out of our 1,000 sample. Those are the main stimulants that were described as being problematic. And I've broken down the, where it says residential here and methadone, these are the two main treatment settings. The residential services are broadly the ones that, they're very similar to the ones in the Scandinavian countries. The methadone programs are the outpatient methadone services. I'm going to say least about these because the methadone only 3% of the people going to the methadone programs describe stimulants as being a main problem for them. Not surprisingly, in a methadone program, the orientation is very much towards opiates as the main problem. 25% of the people going to the residential programs describe stimulants as being their main problem within a pattern of multiple drug use. And these are the drugs that we use. If you wonder why we've separated out cocaine powder from crack cocaine, well, yes, you're right. Both drugs are in fact cocaine. I mean, the crack cocaine is not a different type of drug, that is true. On the other hand, there are clear differences between the way in which cocaine powder is used and the way in which crack cocaine is used. There are also, it's increasingly clear that there are differences in the types of drug user who are taking these drugs. So we tended to collect data separately for cocaine powder and crack cocaine and to treat them as if they were different drugs. It's worth noticing, I'm not actually going to say anything much else about the methadone programs, but I'll just draw your attention to this figure. It's very interesting that of the people who went into the methadone programs, although only 3% of them said stimulants were their main drug, 2/3 of them were actually using crack cocaine in the period immediately prior to intake to treatment. This is a big problem, the use of crack cocaine. I'm aware of the fact that cocaine problems have not spread so widely into continental Europe as they have in Britain, but one of the secondary messages of this talk is that I would urge you to watch carefully for the development of crack cocaine problems. During the 1980s, when America was developing a big problem with crack cocaine, we had lots of Americans coming over to Britain, and also I'm sure to continental Europe, saying, we're having this problem, what America has today, Europe will have tomorrow, which of course is precisely the sort of message that makes people feel very resistant to the American message. And there was great resistance to this message in the UK, and people felt, no, we don't believe this. Just because America has the problem, there's no reason why it should come to us. But since that time, during the last 10 years, there has been a steady year after year increase in the prevalence of crack cocaine use and in the development of crack cocaine problems within the clinical services. It is now clear that, that Britain has a big problem with crack cocaine. Crack cocaine is now starting to be a major issue within the treatment services. Now, whether that will continue and develop in other European countries, I don't know, but I would urge you to not be complacent about crack cocaine, because it's a big issue for us, and it's something that's developed gradually and steadily over those periods. So what are the outcomes for the stimulant users after treatment? Let me show you some of the outcome data. This breaks down, this shows the 1 year outcomes. I'll show you the longer outcomes in a moment. And we felt it was important, bearing in mind what I said about dimensions of drug use, we broke down the stimulant users into 3 groups. These are the ones for whom stimulants were clearly their main drug of dependence, or their main problem drug. And this was the smallest group. There was also a much larger group who were regular and frequent and often high-dose users of stimulants. And there were another group who were just taking them very occasionally. And we broke down the outcomes for these 3 groups. It's quite clear that for these 2 groups, who are the main problem users of drugs, there is a big reduction, particularly for the people for whom stimulants were their main problem drug, from intake to prior to intake to treatment and at 1 year follow-up. This represents a huge reduction in use. I mean, it's about a quarter of intake level, so that's a very substantial drop in the use of stimulants. Amongst the people who were not experiencing stimulants as being a big problem, there was no change at all in their use. Here's the same data but shown over a 5-year period. And the 3 groups are all shown in blocks. So that the red group, the red bar, are the people for whom stimulants were their main problem drug. And you can see it goes down from intake to 1 year, as you've just seen, and it then remains at a low level across this period. It goes down a bit and then it goes up a bit, but it remains from here to here is still a very huge drop in use. For the high rate users, it goes down and then drifts up a bit. And for the low rate users, it simply drifts up across all of these follow-up points. So there are quite clear differences in outcome depending upon the extent of involvement with stimulants of these people at intake. And one of the interesting features is this grey group, the people who were only describing low rates of use at intake. They appear to have been untouched by treatment. The people who were most affected by treatment are the main drug users, who show a very substantial reduction. Here's a breakdown in use showing regular use of each of the 3 stimulant drugs. This is for amphetamines only, and this is shown for regular use. Regular use is defined as using weekly or more frequently. Most of the people who we described as regular users were using about 4, 5, 6 times a week, so they're very regular users. You could regard this as being a polite way of saying addictive, if you want to look at it in those terms. So the number of people who are regular users goes down with the most dramatic reduction at 1 year, and it then remains low, but there's some drift upwards, not significant. So effectively you get a substantial reduction here. Cocaine powder, again the reduction shows very much the same pattern. Big reductions occurring during the first year, which are substantially maintained. There's some drift, but the reduction is still highly significant across the 5-year period. And crack cocaine, well, the pattern for crack cocaine is slightly different in that, yes, it does go down. It's more than halved during the first year, but it then drifts up again. So the number of people who are regular users does drift back. The outcomes for NTORs, which I'm not going to describe to you in great detail, are broad. Most of the results show good outcomes. Typically, across a wide range of measures of outcome, you get very positive findings with reductions in problem behaviours. The two areas in which you get more difficult outcomes or worse outcomes are in the area of crack cocaine use and alcohol use. And I'll go on to say something about that. Here are the outcomes shown separately for people who were using crack cocaine at intake, which is the yellow bar, the yellow line, and the people who were not using crack cocaine at intake to treatment, which is by far the largest group. This is about 1/4 of the sample, this is about 3/4 of the sample. This increase in use here, although it looks, because of the way the chart is drawn, it looks less dramatic than the reduction. This, in a way, is actually more interesting and more important and perhaps more troublesome in interpreting these data, because this is a very large group of people, and what you have during this period are people starting to use crack cocaine. Many of these people, I'm surprised to say, had never used crack cocaine in their entire lives in 1995 when they entered treatment. I say to my surprise, this group of addicts is highly problematic. I mean, these are really seriously dependent, long-term, chronic drug addicts. They've used virtually every drug you've ever heard of, and some you probably haven't heard of. And it's interesting that many of them had not used crack cocaine at that period of time. And I suspect, we don't quite know what this increase means, but I suspect that it's closely related to the increase in the availability of crack cocaine in Britain, and also to the increased... Crack cocaine has now become much more built into the fabric of society. It's not exactly normalised as a drug, but it's very easy to find. I'm taking a long time about this. The problem about having a long time to give a talk is that you become self-indulgent and start this could become a 5-hour talk. Okay, let me say something about the instability of drug use over time. This is what I've been talking about in relation to crack cocaine. There are clearly changes over time. There's also regional variations within countries, the geographical differences in drug use. As an Englishman coming to this conference, I'm clearly aware of the fact that the situation in the Scandinavian countries is different to what it is in Britain. But in all of our countries there are regional, local variations in drug use. which are extremely important. This shows, again in Britain, the development of heroin smoking. Heroin smoking developed over a 20-year period, particularly during the period from about the late 1970s, round about here. The red bar shows the number of people it shows the route of administration by which heroin users first took their very first dose of heroin. So if you were a heroin user in the 1960s, then almost everybody who was a heroin user in the 1980s, at that time the use of heroin was almost synonymous with injection. So if you described somebody as being a heroin addict, everybody thought of somebody sticking a needle in their arm, they thought of a heroin injector. During this period of time, the people start to use heroin by chasing the dragon. This coincides with changes in the availability of the type of heroin. At this time, heroin in Britain was Southeast Asian heroin from the Golden Triangle area. This heroin the smokable heroin is from Southwest Asia. It's Pakistani heroin, Afghan heroin, and so on, which is a different type of heroin. It's a heroin base, which is very readily, when you heat it, it vaporizes, and it's typically smoked. Almost everyone now who takes heroin for the first time in the UK starts to do so by smoking it. So this raises issues about, well, why do they then subsequently change, which is a different question. Here's some data on the use of cocaine. This data is rather old. It only goes up to 1991. But it shows the period in which crack cocaine was starting to appear. This trend continues upwards here, though I don't have the data on this slide. So typically, during the early phases, you had some people injecting it, but most of the people in the grey bar are the people who were taking cocaine by snorting it, by sniffing it. And this is cocaine powder. But this is the beginning of the crack cocaine problem in Britain. The late 1980s were when crack cocaine started to appear, and it's continued to develop since that period of time. So these issues of how people take drugs, this is a relatively short period of time. I mean, within a decade, you can see marked changes. Some of these changes can occur more rapidly than that, but it's worth bearing in mind that changes in route of administration can establish themselves and develop relatively rapidly within populations. And this shows the injection of crack cocaine, which is a very bizarre behavior. You would think that crack cocaine, since it is deliberately manufactured to be smokable, would always be smoked. But we're now starting to see problems of people injecting crack cocaine, which is a highly problematic behavior. Crack cocaine, it's not easy to inject crack cocaine, and injectors often inject it through large bore needles. Large bore needles are not easy to get hold of, so there's increased sharing of them, increased use of non-sterile needles, and so on. And these are regions of Britain, so this stands for North Thames and South Thames region, so it's the sort of areas around Greater London divided by the river, and the southwest of England, the Midlands, the northwest, and the northeast of England. It's clear that it's in the south of England, in the southeast of England, and the southwest of England, particularly the southwest of England, that crack injecting is much more common. These show the odds ratios, so the people in the southwest of England are twice as likely as everybody else in this cohort to be taking crack cocaine by injection. In contrast, if you go up to the northeast of England, almost nobody is doing it. It's extremely rare. So there are huge variations in this particular practice. You could demonstrate it for other behaviours, but this just demonstrates a particularly dramatic regional variation in drug-taking practices. Okay, back to the outcomes then. This shows the rates of injecting and the rates of sharing injecting equipment. amongst the stimulant users who went into the residential programs. Reductions in injecting, which is the stacked red bar, much more important are the reductions in the sharing of injecting equipment. It's troubling that almost a quarter of this sample were sharing injecting equipment in the 90 days prior to admission to treatment. I regard that as an extremely high rate of needle sharing for all of the obvious reasons. It is reduced, it's substantially reduced, but it doesn't go away. Nonetheless, these are important gains and have clear implications both for the users and for the public health. This shows some data on hepatitis infection rates. There's been massive amounts of interest in HIV and AIDS related illnesses. It's only comparatively recently that we've begun to focus upon hepatitis, which is a much more prevalent and possibly even much more worrying problem in many of our drug-addicted groups. These are the... Hello, my batteries run out here. This is the hepatitis C infection rate by the number of years of use, number of years since the first injection of drugs. And for this group, the very long-term 20-year plus injectors, almost 100% of them, almost every single person who's been injecting drugs for more than 20 years is infected with the hepatitis C virus. And much more than 3/4 of them are infected with hepatitis B. There is basically almost a linear development in risk of infection that occurs, with the very important exception that for hepatitis C, infection rates start from a very high level. Your chances of contracting hepatitis C is a very infectious virus, and many of these people get infected with it at a very early stage. It's likely that many of these people may even become infected with HCV at the very first injection that they have. So there are extremely powerful prevention issues to do with injection and route of administration there. Okay, drinking. I just want to very briefly say something about drinking. This is in my opinion, this is the worst outcome we have in the NTOR study. There is this is just average, these are average scores, but there is basically, this is not significant. There is no reduction in frequency of drinking after treatment. And the reduction, this looks like it might be significant, but it isn't. There is in fact no difference in the amount of alcohol that these people are consuming. Bear in mind that many drug addicts are not drinkers. Many of them are. They tend to divide up into two groups. Either they don't drink it at all or hardly ever, or they are highly problematic drinkers. So these are mean scores, and they therefore underestimate how much drinking is going on by individuals. But these are average daily amounts of use of the equivalent of about 1 bottle of wine. If you're infected with the hepatitis virus and you're drinking a bottle of wine every day, it will kill you. There is no doubt that you will develop serious liver disease at a very accelerated rate, and it's a very serious threat to your health. It's probably much more likely that these people will die of drinking-related problems than of any other single cause. So the fact that you have a poor outcome for drinking is extraordinarily important. And it's particularly important because the people who tend to be doing the most drinking are the stimulant users. The amphetamine users are shown in red, and you can see that they drink about twice as much alcohol as the other drug users. Bear in mind that all of these people are severely problematic, addicted users, and the amphetamine users are drinking twice as much, and they're drinking much more frequently. So stimulant use and alcohol often goes together in a particularly problematic way. I think that alcohol is, George de Leon described alcohol as the hidden drug. when we talk about drug addicts, and it truly is. We focus upon drugs because of their high profile, the fact that they're illegal. We give enormous attention to them. There is no question that we should be paying much more attention to drinking. Criminal behaviour, okay, very, very quickly. This is not unimportant. It's extremely important from a political point of view, and these data had a huge impact upon the British government, for example, and led to significant changes in policy with regard to treatment in the UK. This shows reductions in crimes of theft, burglary, shoplifting, that sort of thing. These people are highly criminally active, commit enormous amounts of crime, and there are substantial reductions in their criminal behaviour after treatment. Again, selling drugs is another common way of them financing their habits. It's something that the general public becomes enormously anxious about. It's the media focus on it a lot, and again, very substantial reductions in drug selling among these people. As I say, this is an issue that clinically, the clinical services tend not to focus very much upon crime, but its political and economic significance is enormous. Okay, well, some conclusions and implications. Firstly, one of the things I want to say is that overall, these data show that there are a substantial range of improvements that occur after stimulant users have been treated within existing services. The NTOR study is not a study of specially developed services, it's just a study of ordinary, standard, existing services as they are already set up across the UK. And it's quite clear that many of these people, particularly in this case the ones who went to the residential programs, show important gains in many of their important problem behaviours. They show reduced drug use, they show reduced injection risk behaviour, particularly sharing of needles, they show improved health, they show reduced criminal behaviour. However, they show little change in their drinking problems, which I think is something that I really would draw your attention to. And finally, on the issue of treatments, these data that I've shown you have been mainly to do with treatment in residential programs. That is only because that's where the stimulant users tend to go in the UK. But there are many different types of treatment. What these data do not show is that stimulant users automatically get better if you push them into any sort of treatment. That is not correct. If we wish to develop services, particularly treatment services for stimulant users, there are a number of issues that we need to pay careful attention to, particularly the specific interventions that are delivered, the treatment setting in which it's delivered, whether it's residential, outpatient, or even in primary care services, the treatment intensity. Do they need very long periods of treatment, or can they be treated using brief therapies? These are all questions that remain largely unanswered. And particularly, what is to be the goal or treatment focus for stimulant users? This is extraordinarily important, particularly for treatment services, because society regularly dumps its problems on the treatment services. Society decides, for various reasons, often not sensible reasons, that it doesn't like a problem, and it pushes it towards the treatment services and then says to the treatment services, okay, it's up to you, you sort out this problem. So it's very important that we focus upon what is to be the goal of treatment. What exactly are we treating here? And that's something that, really all of us who work in the treatment field need to do continuously, particularly in this area of stimulant treatments. Otherwise, we'll be having people sent to us who are not suitable cases for treatment. Okay, that's it. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.